So why is everybody and their mother getting into podcasting? Is it really that popular of a medium? Is it just that easy to kind of get into? Or is there something else going on that we're just not seeing? Today I'm going to talk about what podcasting is, why I think it's becoming such a popular form of content creation, and also some of the things you might want to consider if you yourself want to get into podcasting. So we need to start by talking about what is podcasting. Podcasting really is rooted in radio broadcasting, in that it is basically a radio broadcast being distributed over the internet. So think about things like radio dramas, talk shows, news programming, just different kind of radio programming that used to follow more of a linear path, now being served in the form of a condensed thing that you can download and listen to on demand on a podcasting platform. I remember the early days of the iPod and iTunes introducing the idea of the podcast, and essentially what it was pretty much just downloading radio programming onto your iPod and basically being able to listen to it on the go. That's kind of the entire idea. You get to listen to what would normally be your radio programming on demand. Over the years, more and more people started getting into podcasting, and now podcasting looks a little bit different than what, those traditional radio programming, audio only podcasts were like maybe even 10 years ago. These days, it feels like there's a podcast for just about everything, and a lot of different people are getting into podcasting. You're seeing athletes, comedians, journalists, Twitch streamers. You're also seeing business people, accountants, real estate people, all creating podcasts specifically to talk about their specific industry. It almost feels like the self-help books of yesteryear, where basically it's just like how to do this for dummies. Instead, it's here's a podcast talking about this. So the thing that I think really makes podcasting attractive as a form of content creation is the barrier to entry. It's not very hard to get into podcasting these days. Literally, in order to create a podcast, all you have to do is really be able to record audio in a digital format, which anybody can do from their cell phone. And if you want to have a more higher quality podcast, you can get up and running for about under $300 in equipment. And with RSS, it's actually really easy to distribute your podcast. There are a lot of different services online that you can actually go to and basically upload your audio and your podcast to, and it will distribute it out to the different podcasting platforms through RSS feeds. And so it makes it very simple to get your podcast out there. And especially nowadays, it's actually become very easy to do podcasting, not just in person, but you can also do remote shows using things like Discord and OBS and record that way. That's actually what I end up doing for a lot of my podcast. But I think the thing that has really unlocked the popularity of podcasts has become the video podcast. Nowadays, there's always a video element tied to the podcast. You actually can go on YouTube and you can actually look up podcasts, and people will actually have produced podcast of them actually in the room talking with the person or talking over a Skype call or a Discord call. Who uses Skype anymore? Am I bringing up Skype? But Discord, which I typically use for my podcasting, but you can also use Zoom and other teleconferencing programs in order to do it. There's even some people who are live streaming the recording of their podcast. So they're actually even going back to the radio style thing, where it's actually a live broadcast of the radio show, but then the actual broadcast lives on as a video on demand asset that you can find. And the thing about it too is once the podcast is recorded and done as a video podcast, you can actually clip it down to different segments and actually share it as a short form piece of content on different platforms, promoting the larger form of content. And I think that's kind of where the popularity has kind of come from, more or less, than anything else. It is an easy way into content creation. It is favored by algorithms like YouTube, who want you to make longer form content, but still have the opportunity to clip it down into shorter form content that can get used on platforms like Instagram Reels, TikTok, assuming it survives, and a lot of other, and even on YouTube Shorts itself, and you can actually promote your longer form podcast on a YouTube short. So the question kind of becomes, why should somebody get into podcasting? And that's a very difficult question. I think one, if you want to start podcasting, it's because you want to get into some style of content creation. And podcasting can actually be a very good entryway because it requires probably the least amount of pre-production, depending on what you're doing. If you're just doing a talk show style, just kind of sit down and chat with friends style podcast. If you're doing something a little bit more complicated, you are going to maybe have to do some pre-production work, but you don't have to, is kind of the great thing about it. I think people who are trying to develop their skills as on camera or on microphone talent, actually podcasting can be very good, because if you can sustain a conversation, even if you are just talking into a microphone or talking to a camera, that's a harder skill than a lot of people realize. I certainly have not mastered it, but it is something that can help you develop that skill set and get better at over time. And I think another attractive thing about podcasting is the monetization aspect. If you create a large enough audience, you can start running ads on your podcast, or you can even go the crowdfunding route and have your audience directly support you from platforms like Patreon. So this gets into why maybe you shouldn't get into podcasting, and I think you shouldn't get into podcasting if, one, you can't fit it into your schedule. Content creation, especially things like podcasting, kind of needs to have a level of consistency. You need to be putting out content on a regular basis at a regular cadence, and if it's not something you can fit into your schedule, it's probably not going to work. I think another thing that should keep you from doing podcasting is if you feel like you just have nothing to say. I think podcasting for the sake of podcasting is not inherently a good strategy. I think you actually have to have some thought put into what it is you're messaging and what it is you're trying to kind of communicate, whether it's just you sitting down with friends and having a chat, whether it's talking about a specific subject that you're really into, or maybe you're trying to like kind of maybe work on more of your comedic style and like how you present yourself on camera. Regardless, you need to really kind of think about what kind of content you're trying to make. And then finally, you really just shouldn't get into podcasting if your heart's just not in it. It is one of those things where if it becomes a chore, it's just not worth doing at some point, because you can put a lot of time and energy into other things that might be more beneficial to you, your brand, your business, or just even your own mental health. If you're trying to basically add another thing on top of your already busy schedule, and you're just not really that enthusiastic about it, I would advise just steering clear. But if you are looking at getting into podcasting and you're basically think you can actually keep something consistent, here are some tips that I have for you. Stay on top of current events related to your industry or your subject matter. Being really on top of what's kind of going on will help foster topics and things to talk about, if that's specifically the kind of podcast that you're trying to make. Have guests and co-hosts specifically who have really good chemistry with each other. I think a lot of the most popular podcasts tend to be things where the people interacting with each other have a very good rapport. Sometimes they can even be antagonistic. They don't necessarily have to get along, but they have an ability in a relationship to kind of go back and forth and make the podcast more dynamic. Another thing I would recommend a lot for podcasters is to not take it too seriously. I think when you try and force things, especially on internet content, it comes through and audiences tend to kind of tune out when it seems like you're trying to be a little bit too button up. Crack a joke, make a quip, kind of don't be afraid to laugh and maybe break or stumble on your words. Be genuine, be authentic. That's kind of where I'm going with that. And then finally, and I brought this up when I was talking about if you shouldn't do podcasts, have a consistent upload schedule. Make the plan, make the time of day, make sure that you're scheduling things out accordingly. I typically would recommend a every other week cadence starting out. You can do monthly, but I think if you do monthly, it's one of those things that you'll kick down the road. If you do every other week of recording, editing, and publishing, that will actually go a very long way of creating the momentum. And if it starts to really kind of pick up, you can start looking at doing a weekly show or a daily show, depending on specifically what your bandwidth is and how important podcasting has become to you. But these are just some of the thoughts I've had about podcasting and the state of that form of content creation, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. Go ahead and leave in the comments what you like about podcasting and what you would like to see more from in the podcasting space. I'm Anglin, and I'll see you guys next time.